They laughed when he paid $2 for a woman with a sack over her head, and by sundown they realized he was the only man in town who had seen her worth. The auction took place at high noon, right there beside the feed store where dust always gathered in small, restless spirals, as if the earth itself refused to settle in that town. Men stood with thumbs hooked in their suspenders, boots planted in the dirt, hats tipped low against a sun that burned at near 90 degrees, and on the wooden platform was a single figure, hands folded, shoulders straight, a coarse burlap sack covering her head and falling to her collarbone, turning her into something less than a person and more than an object to be inspected. The auctioneer's voice carried across Main Street, sharp and bright, calling out numbers as though he were selling a mule that had lost a step, and every time a bid came short, the crowd answered with low chuckles that rolled like distant thunder. Nobody asked her name. Nobody asked her story, because stories cost time and time cost money, and this town preferred the cheaper option. Ezekiel Boone stood at the edge of it all, 6'3" in worn work boots, shoulders thick from years of splitting timber in the Cascades, hands scarred by honest labor and cold winters that dipped below freezing without apology. He smelled faintly of pine sap and would smoke. A man who spent more time among Douglas firs than among people, and most folks figured he'd come into town only to sell lumber and leave before sunset. He didn't step forward when the first bid was called, nor the second. He watched the way the woman held herself, not slumped, not trembling, just still, as if the sack over her head could not bend her spine, and that stillness unsettled him more than any raised voice could have. $2, he said at last, and the words did not sound loud, but they carried. A few men barked out laughter, one slapped his knee, another muttered that Boone had finally decided to buy himself company, and the auctioneer, eager to close a deal that barely covered the cost of the platform, struck the gavel against wood with a crack that echoed down the street. $2 silver changed hands, light in weight, heavy in meaning, and just like that the crowd began to disperse, interest fading as quickly as it had flared. To them, it was finished, another spectacle tucked into memory alongside cattle trades and crop failures. Ezekiel stepped onto the platform without hurry, removed his hat out of simple respect, and stood a yard away from the woman. He did not reach for her, did not speak to claim ownership, only said, steady and low, "Ma'am, you're coming with me, but you're not obligated to stay." And though she could not see his face, something in his tone carried the quiet authority of a man who chopped down trees for a living yet never boasted about the strength it took. The wagon waited at the edge of town, hitched to a bay mare that flicked her tail against flies, and as he guided the woman up onto the seat, he noticed how carefully she placed her boots, how she measured the step before taking it, like someone accustomed to polished floors rather than muddy streets. The burlap shifted slightly in the dry wind, but she kept it in place with one composed hand, and Ezekiel felt a strange certainty settle in his chest, a feeling that the $2 he had spent were not a purchase but a line drawn quietly in the dust, a refusal to let a human being be reduced to a bargain. Behind them, laughter lingered, thin and fading, and ahead of them the road stretched west for 20 miles into timber and silence, where judgment had no audience and a man's character was measured not by how much he paid, but by what he chose to protect. The road out of town narrowed to a pair of ruts carved by years of wagon wheels, and as the last wooden storefront disappeared behind them, the air seemed to change, carrying the sharp scent of pine and damp earth instead of whiskey and gossip. Ezekiel Boone kept his eyes forward, reins loose in his large hands, giving the bay mare her head as she settled into a steady pace of about 4 miles an hour, the wagon creaking in rhythm with the turn of the wheels. Beside him, the woman sat upright, the burlap sack still covering her head, not fidgeting, not pleading, not demanding explanation, and the silence between them stretched long and deliberate, like the tree line ahead, dense and unbroken. After nearly a mile, when the town was nothing more than a memory swallowed by dust, Ezekiel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small brass key, holding it out halfway between them without looking directly at her. "This is for the front door," he said evenly. "You can use it however you choose." The words were simple, but they carried weight, and for a moment the only sound was the steady clop of hooves against packed dirt. She did not take the key immediately. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as though measuring the truth in his voice. and then her gloved fingers closed around the cool metal with care that suggested she had once handled finer things than wagon keys and rough timber locks. The forest thickened as they moved west, tall firs rising more than 100 feet overhead, their branches weaving together to soften the late afternoon sun into filtered gold. Ezekiel felt the familiar calm settle into his bones, the kind that came only when he was surrounded by trees that asked nothing of him except honest work. He cleared his throat once, not out of discomfort, but because silence deserved acknowledgement. "There is food in the pantry," he said. "Flour, dried beans, some salt pork. You are welcome to it." She nodded once, a restrained motion beneath the sack, and that small gesture told him more than any speech could have. There was gratitude there, but not submission, and he found himself oddly relieved. When his cabin finally came into view, tucked against a gentle rise about 20 yards from a narrow creek, smoke still drifting faintly from the stone chimney, he guided the wagon to a stop and stepped down first, boots landing solid on familiar ground. He did not reach to help her down until she shifted forward on her own, and even then his hand hovered rather than grasped. Offering steadiness without control, she descended carefully, boots touching the earth of his land as though crossing an invisible threshold. The cabin was modest, no more than 800 square feet, built from timber he had felled and shaped himself, its porch shaded by a simple overhang that creaked softly in the breeze. He gestured toward the door. "You may remove the sack whenever you are ready," he said, voice low, steady as a winter. "River. No one here will look at you as property." The wind moved through the trees with a quiet sigh, carrying the scent of sap and distant rain, and in that stillness, far from the eyes of a crowd, Ezekiel understood something he had never named before. Whatever she chose to reveal next would not change the fact that, for the first time in years, his cabin did not feel like a place built only for one man. The creek behind the cabin moved with a steady murmur, no louder than a man speaking under his breath, and as the late afternoon light thinned into amber, the woman stood on the porch with the brass key resting in her palm, the burlap sack still hiding her face from the world. Ezekiel Boone did not watch her directly, but he felt the weight of the moment the way a woodsman feels a tree lean before it falls, subtle and certain. He stepped back, giving her space, boots settling against the worn planks of the porch, and folded his hands loosely in front of him as if waiting outside a church door rather than his own cabin. The forest held its breath. Even the wind seemed to slow. Slowly, with movements that carried neither fear nor hesitation, she lifted her hands to the edge of the sack and paused for a heartbeat, as though shedding not only fabric but a layer of humiliation stitched there by strangers. The coarse material slid upward and off, revealing hair the color of dark honey pulled back in a simple twist, strands catching the last light of day, and eyes steady and clear, not defiant, not pleading, but composed. She did not rush to speak. She looked at the cabin first, at the squared beams and the hand-carved railing, at the stack of split logs measured neatly along the wall, and something softened in her expression, not weakness, but recognition of labor done with care. Ezekiel met her gaze then, not as a buyer inspecting goods, but as a man meeting another equal beneath an open sky, and he removed his hat fully, holding it at his side. There was a faint line along her cheek where the sack had pressed against skin, and he felt a flicker of regret that the world had ever forced her to wear it. "You are safe here," he said, quietly, voice steady as the creek. She studied him for a long moment, assessing not his height or the breadth of his shoulders, but the steadiness in his stance, the absence of demand in his eyes, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the cadence of someone educated, measured, raised among people who expected to be heard. "You paid $2, she said, not accusing, not grateful, simply stating a fact. He nodded once. "That was the price they named," he replied. A faint, almost imperceptible curve touched her lips, not amusement, but understanding. "And what do you believe I am worth, Mr. Boone?" The question hung in the cooling air, heavier than coin. He did not answer quickly. He glanced toward the trees, toward the horizon that had been his only companion for years, then back at her. "More than any man in that town could afford," he said at last. Something in her posture shifted then, the tightness in her shoulders easing by a fraction, and she stepped forward onto the porch fully, no longer a figure hidden beneath burlap, but a woman standing in open light. The creek kept moving. The forest resumed its quiet rustle, and Ezekiel understood that whatever storm had begun in town had not followed them into the trees. What stood between them now was not ownership, not obligation, but the fragile beginning of respect. And in that stillness, beneath a sky turning deep blue, he realized the true test of a man was not what he could cut down with an axe, but what he could choose to build with patience. Evening settled slowly over the clearing, the last ribbon of sunlight slipping behind the ridge and leaving the cabin wrapped in a cool blue hush. Inside, Ezekiel Boone lit a single oil lamp and set it on the rough wooden table he had built with his own hands, the flame steady, unhurried, casting long shadows against the log walls. The woman stepped across the threshold without waiting to be invited, not out of defiance, but because she understood that hesitation would only make the space smaller. And as her boots touched the wide pine floorboards, she paused to take in the room with a careful, discerning gaze. There was a cast iron stove against the far wall, a narrow bed neatly made with a wool blanket folded square at the foot, shelves lined with tin plates and 2 cups, no more, and a Bible resting beside a small stack of letters tied with twine. Nothing extravagant, nothing careless, only order and intention. Ezekiel placed his hat on a peg by the door and moved toward the stove, adding a split log with quiet efficiency, the scent of fresh pine resin rising into the air as the wood caught flame. "Supper is simple," he said evenly. "Beans and cornbread." She inclined her head once, then surprised him by setting her gloves aside and reaching for the kettle without asking permission, testing its weight as though accustomed to kitchens that expected her hands to be useful. There was no clatter, no wasted motion. She measured water by sight, not guesswork, and adjusted the stove draft with a familiarity that did not match the humiliation she had endured hours before. Ezekiel watched from the corner of his eye, not suspicious, but curious, noting how she wiped the rim of the pot before placing it down, how she folded the dishcloth neatly instead of tossing it aside. After a few quiet minutes, she spoke again, voice low, controlled. "You live alone by choice, Mr. Boone." He leaned against the counter, arms loose at his sides. "It became easier that way," he answered. "Trees do not argue. They only fall where you guide them." A faint warmth touched her expression, something between empathy and recognition. "People are not trees," she said. "No," he replied. "They are not." The lamp flame flickered as a draft slipped through the chinks between logs, and for a moment the light traced the fine lines at the corner of her eyes. Lines not of age but of experience, of having stood her ground more than once. She moved to the table and placed 2 plates across from one another, not side by side, not distant, but facing, as equals might sit. Ezekiel noticed the choice and felt a quiet respect take root in his chest. When they finally sat, the cabin filled with the simple aroma of cooked beans and warm bread, and the silence between them no longer felt strained, but deliberate, like a page waiting for ink. Outside, the creek continued its steady murmur, and the forest kept its patient watch, and inside that small cabin, beneath the soft glow of lamplight, 2 strangers shared a meal not bound by purchase, not defined by a price, but shaped instead by the careful distance that allows dignity to breathe. Night settled fully over the cabin, pressing gently against the window panes, and the oil lamp cast a circle of warm light that made the small room feel steadier than the wide, dark forest outside. Ezekiel Boone finished his meal without haste, setting his spoon down carefully, never letting his gaze linger too long on the woman across from him, not out of indifference, but out of respect for the space she had not yet decided to give. She ate with quiet composure, breaking the cornbread into even pieces, not crumbling it, not wasting a single bite, and when she finished, she folded her napkin precisely and placed it beside her plate as though the act itself restored a fragment of order to a day that had begun in humiliation. For a moment neither of them spoke, and the only sound was the faint crackle from the stove and the steady murmur of the creek 20 yards beyond the door. Ezekiel rose first, collecting the plates without ceremony, and carried them to the basin. Before he could reach for the cloth, she stood as well, stepping beside him with quiet certainty. "Allow me," she said, voice calm, not demanding, not pleading, simply offering. He hesitated, then nodded once and stepped aside, giving her room. She washed the dishes with deliberate care, hands steady in the lamplight, and he noticed again the small details that did not match the story the town had tried to write for her. The way she tested the water temperature before dipping the tin plates, the way she dried each one fully before stacking them, the way she straightened the edge of the table without thinking. When she finished, she turned to him, no longer framed by shadow, and the air between them felt less like a standoff and more like a question waiting to be answered. "You have shown restraint," she said quietly. "Most men would not." Ezekiel leaned against the counter, broad shoulders relaxed, hands open at his sides. "Most men were bidding today," he replied. "I was not." The lamp flame flickered once, reflecting in her eyes, and for the first time there was something unguarded there, not vulnerability, but consideration. She reached into the pocket of her skirt and withdrew a small folded handkerchief, embroidered with a single initial stitched in fine thread, and held it for a moment before closing her fingers around it again, as though weighing whether to reveal more than fabric. "I intend to earn my keep while I am here," she said. "I do not accept charity." He studied her carefully, recognizing pride not as arrogance, but as survival. "There is wood to split tomorrow," he answered evenly, "and a fence line that needs mending. The work does not belong to one pair of hands." A faint nod acknowledged the fairness in that offer, and the tension that had followed them from town seemed to thin, like mist lifting from the creek at dawn. Outside, the wind moved through the trees with a low whisper, and inside that cabin, beneath the steady glow of a single lamp, two strangers began to shift from transaction to partnership, not through grand declarations, but through small choices made in silence, choices that carried more weight than any coin exchanged in a crowded street. Morning arrived with a thin veil of mist rising from the creek, pale and silver in the first light, and Ezekiel Boone was already awake before the sun cleared the ridge, standing on the porch with a tin cup of black coffee warming his hands. The air held the clean bite of early spring, somewhere near 45 degrees, and the forest stretched quiet and endless around the cabin. Inside, he heard movement, not hurried, not uncertain, but steady, and when the door opened behind him, the woman stepped out wrapped in a simple shawl he had left folded over a chair the night before. She paused at the edge of the porch, drawing in a slow breath as though testing the scent of pine and damp earth, and for a moment she simply watched the trees sway in the soft morning breeze. "It is quieter than I expected," she said, voice low, almost thoughtful. Ezekiel nodded once without turning fully. "The trees speak," he replied, "just not in words." She studied the clearing, the woodpile stacked nearly 5 feet high against the side of the cabin, the fence line stretching toward the creek, and then her gaze returned to him. "Show me the work," she said. There was no hesitation in her tone. He set his cup aside and handed her a pair of worn leather gloves that had once belonged to his late sister, small enough to fit her hands. She accepted them with a measured nod and followed him to the splitting block where a round of pine waited, about 18 inches across. Ezekiel lifted the axe first, demonstrating the rhythm rather than the force, the controlled swing, the way the blade met the grain and parted it cleanly without fury. The crack of wood carried sharp through the clearing, then faded into the hush of morning. When he stepped back, she did not rush forward. She tested the weight of the handle, adjusted her grip slightly lower than he had shown, and brought the axe down with more precision than strength. The log split unevenly but clean enough, and she exhaled softly, not in frustration, but in quiet acknowledgement of effort. Ezekiel watched without correction, recognizing determination shaped by dignity rather than pride. They worked side by side for nearly an hour, stacking split pieces into a neat row, the scent of fresh sap clinging to their sleeves, and though sweat gathered lightly at her brow, she did not complain, did not falter, and did not once ask to be relieved. When they finally paused, standing near the fence where a rail had sagged loose from its post, she rested her hands on the top board and looked out toward the forest. "You built all of this yourself?" she said. He nodded. "Every beam." She ran her fingers along the smooth surface of the wood, tracing the grain with thoughtful care. "Then you understand something most men do not," she said quietly. "Value is not decided by those who gather to shout a number. It is shaped over time by steady hands." The wind shifted then, lifting a strand of her hair into the light, and Ezekiel felt the truth of her words settle deep within him. The town had measured her in coins and spectacle, but here, beneath open sky and honest labor, something else was taking form, something that could not be auctioned, something that would demand patience rather than payment. By late afternoon, the sun stood high and pale above the treetops, casting long, clean beams across the clearing, and the rhythm of shared labor had settled into something unspoken and steady. Ezekiel Boone drove the final nail into the fence rail with controlled strikes of his hammer, not forceful, not careless, and when he stepped back to inspect the line, it stood straight and firm against the stretch of open land. She stood beside him, brushing sawdust from her skirt, her gloves smudged with pine sap, her breathing measured but strong, and there was no trace left of the figure who had once stood silent beneath burlap before a jeering crowd. The work had changed her posture, or perhaps revealed what had always been there. "You handle tools like you have done it before," Ezekiel observed quietly. She glanced toward the forest, sunlight catching the edge of her profile. "I was not raised helpless," she replied. "My father believed that land does not respect titles, only effort." The word father lingered in the air between them, heavier than the hammer at his side. Ezekiel did not press, but he listened. She walked toward the woodpile and ran her hand along the stacked logs, each cut to near identical length, each aligned with care. "This place," she continued, "was not built by a man who thinks small." He let out a slow breath through his nose, almost a silent laugh. "It was built by a man who did not want to depend on anyone else." She turned then, studying him more directly than before. "And yet you bid when others would not." The question beneath her words was gentle but sharp. Ezekiel rested the hammer on the fence post and met her gaze. "There is a difference between independence and indifference," he said. "I chose one, not the other." A breeze moved through the clearing, carrying the faint scent of rain somewhere miles away, and the sound of the creek rose slightly, as if the water itself approved of the truth spoken. She stepped closer to the fence, looking beyond it toward the stretch of forest that marked the edge of his land. "The men in town," she said softly, "believe they were buying obedience." Her voice did not tremble. It did not break. It carried steel beneath silk. They mistook silence for surrender. Ezekiel felt something shift inside him then, not anger, but recognition. He had known silence too, had worn it like armor for years, letting others assume he lacked depth simply because he lacked words. "Silence can mean many things," he replied. "Sometimes it means a person is waiting for the right moment." She held his gaze for a long second, and in that shared quiet there was understanding deeper than conversation. The sun began to lower, shadows stretching across the ground like dark ribbons, and as they walked back toward the cabin side by side, neither leading nor following, the distance between them no longer felt measured in steps or obligation. It felt measured in trust, slowly earned, layer by layer, like timber shaped by patient hands. And somewhere beyond the trees, far from the reach of coin or spectacle, the truth stood taller than any fence they had repaired that day. The sky turned the color of fading copper as evening settled again over the clearing, and a thin band of orange light clung to the tops of the fir trees before surrendering to blue. Ezekiel Boone carried a small crate from the shed toward the porch, his steps unhurried, the weight balanced easily against his broad frame. She stood near the creek, sleeves rolled neatly to her forearms, watching the current move around smooth stones, and when she heard his boots against the dirt, she turned with a look that no longer held guarded distance, but quiet assessment. He set the crate down and opened it without ceremony, revealing ledgers bound in worn leather, edges softened by years of use. "I keep records," he said simply. "Timber sold, supplies bought, weather patterns." She stepped closer, curiosity lighting her eyes in the dimming glow. He handed her one of the books without hesitation. The pages were filled with neat, deliberate script, every number aligned, every note dated, the handwriting firm and consistent, not ornate, but disciplined. She ran her fingers lightly over the ink, then looked up at him with something like surprise. "You are meticulous," she observed. "It is how a man survives alone," he answered. She nodded slowly and closed the ledger, holding it against her palm for a moment as though measuring its weight. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the open page. He inclined his head. She reached into the pocket of her skirt and withdrew a small pencil, worn but sharpened with care, and added a single line beneath the most recent entry, adjusting the column spacing by a fraction of an inch so the numbers aligned more precisely. Ezekiel watched her movements, noticing the steady confidence in her hand, the way she calculated without hesitation, and when she stepped back. The page looked subtly improved, as though order had deepened rather than changed. "You understand accounts," he said, not as a question. She met his gaze directly. "My father believed that land without record is land easily stolen," she replied. The word father carried more weight this time, and the air between them seemed to thicken slightly, not with tension, but with revelation waiting to surface. He closed the ledger and set it aside carefully. "You speak of him as a man of means," he said. She looked toward the horizon, where the last light was fading behind the ridge. "He was," she answered softly, "until he trusted the wrong men." The breeze shifted, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The creek continued its steady murmur, the forest standing tall and silent around them. Ezekiel felt the pieces beginning to align, like beams in a structure he had not known he was building. She was not merely educated. She was not merely proud. There was lineage in her posture, history in her restraint. When she finally turned back toward the cabin, lamplight beginning to glow through the window, her voice was calm but resolute. "There is more you should know," she said, "but I will tell it when I am certain you are ready to hear it." Ezekiel did not press her, did not demand explanation. He simply nodded once, steady as the trees that framed his land. "I will be here," he replied. And in that quiet exchange, beneath a sky now deep and starless, the truth waited just beyond the edge of silence, gathering its strength like dawn behind the hills. Night deepened around the cabin until the forest became a wall of shadow, and inside the steady glow of the oil lamp cast long amber lines across the table where the ledger still rested. Ezekiel Boone sat opposite her, broad hands folded loosely, waiting without impatience, the silence between them no longer uncertain but deliberate. She stood near the window for a moment, looking out into the dark where the trees swayed gently against a sky brushed with faint starlight, and when she finally turned back, there was a resolve in her expression that had been gathering since the creek at dusk. She stepped forward and drew a slow breath. "My name," she said, voice calm, and even, "is Clara Whitmore." The sound of it seemed to settle into the wooden beams of the cabin, as though the walls themselves recognized the weight carried by those two words. Ezekiel did not react with surprise in his posture, but his eyes sharpened, memory aligning quietly behind them. The Whitmore name had once stood carved above the largest building in town, painted in gold lettering on a sign that caught the sun from half a mile away. It had been spoken with respect in supply houses and in church pews, tied to timber rights, to railroad contracts, to acres of land measured in the hundreds. Clara held his gaze, searching not for awe, but for judgment. "My father owned more forest than any man within 50 miles, she continued. He believed partnership was stronger than rivalry. He trusted men who smiled while counting his trees. There was no bitterness in her tone, only clarity. Ezekiel leaned back slightly in his chair, the wood creaking beneath his weight. "And now?" he asked quietly. She reached into her pocket and withdrew the embroidered handkerchief once more, unfolding it to reveal a small folded document tucked inside, edges worn but intact. She placed it on the table between them without flourish. "Now the deeds bear other names," she said. "Names that did not plant a single seed." The lamp flame flickered, reflecting in her eyes, and for a moment the cabin felt smaller, filled not with accusation, but with history pressing forward. "They said my father miscalculated," she added. "They said his generosity was weakness. When he fell ill, the contracts shifted. Debts appeared where none had existed." Ezekiel studied the document, but did not touch it. He understood land. He understood how easily ink could redraw boundaries when a man was no longer strong enough to contest it. "The auction," he said slowly, "was not about marriage." Clara's chin lifted slightly. "It was about erasure," she replied. "A public reminder that a name means nothing when stripped of property." Silence followed, thick but not hostile. Outside, the creek moved steadily, indifferent to titles and loss. Ezekiel rose from his chair and walked to the door, opening it just enough to let the cool night air enter, then turned back toward her. "Out here," he said, voice steady. Land answers to labor, not to signatures alone. Clara watched him carefully, weighing his words the way she had weighed the axe that morning. In that small cabin, beneath timber he had cut and beams he had raised, her name no longer sounded like a fallen banner. It sounded like something waiting to be reclaimed, not with spectacle, not with shouting, but with patience and proof. And as the lamp burned low, Ezekiel understood that the $2 he had placed on a rough wooden platform had not purchased a stranger. They had brought into his quiet clearing a history the town believed it had buried, and the truth of it now sat across from him, unhidden, unbowed, and very much alive. The night stretched long after her confession, and when dawn finally brushed pale light across the ridge, Ezekiel Boone was already awake, standing at the edge of the clearing with the folded document in his hand. The paper felt fragile against his calloused fingers, yet the weight of it seemed heavier than any timber he had hauled down from the mountain. Clara stepped onto the porch a moment later, shawl wrapped neatly around her shoulders, her posture composed as always, though her eyes carried the quiet strain of a name once respected and recently dismissed. The forest breathed in slow rhythm around them, the air cool and clear, and for a time neither of them spoke. Ezekiel unfolded the document carefully and studied the signatures, the dates, the ink that had redrawn boundaries without ever touching the soil. "These deeds were transferred within weeks of your father's illness," he said evenly. Clara nodded. "Men who had shared our tables suddenly claimed oversight," she replied. "They called it protection." The word lingered, hollow in the open air. Ezekiel looked toward the tree line that marked the edge of his own land, acres he had measured in footsteps and sweat rather than inheritance. "Protection does not erase a name," he said. "It tests it." Clara stepped down from the porch and joined him in the clearing, boots pressing into damp earth that smelled of pine and morning frost. "The town believes I have nothing left," she said quietly. "No leverage. No standing." Ezekiel folded the document once more and handed it back to her with deliberate care. "They believe what they can see," he answered. "They saw a sack and a price. They did not see a ledger. They did not see resolve." A faint wind moved through the trees, carrying the promise of rain, and Clara's gaze followed the line of timber stretching west, acres upon acres that had once carried her family's mark. "You intend to go back," she said, studying him closely. It was not an accusation. It was recognition. Ezekiel met her eyes, steady and unflinching. "A man does not need to shout to correct a lie," he replied. "He only needs proof." He gestured toward the cabin, toward the neatly stacked wood, the repaired fence, the land tended with precision. "We gather what is ours by showing what we can build." Clara considered this, her chin lifting slightly, pride no longer wounded but sharpened. "They will not expect patience," she said. "They expect humiliation." Ezekiel allowed a small, restrained smile to touch his face. "Then we give them neither." The morning light grew stronger, illuminating the clearing in clear gold, and in that light the distance between them felt no longer like that of rescuer and rescued, but of partners standing at the edge of a quiet campaign. There would be no raised voices, no spectacle in the town square. There would be records examined, contracts read aloud, histories remembered. Clara Whitmore's name would not return through force. It would return through fact. And as the first drop of rain touched the dust at their feet, darkening the earth in small deliberate circles, Ezekiel understood that the $2 had never been the point. What mattered now was the steady work of restoring something the town had tried to sell as worthless, and in the stillness of that rain-washed morning, both of them knew the reckoning would come not with noise, but with undeniable truth. 2 days later the wagon rolled back toward town under a sky washed clean by rain, the wheels cutting steady tracks through damp earth, and Ezekiel Boone sat upright on the bench with quiet resolve, while Clara Whitmore held the folded deeds in her gloved hands. Neither of them spoke much during the 20-mile ride, because the kind of work awaiting them required clarity, not noise. The town appeared slowly beyond the last bend in the road, wooden storefronts still leaning slightly, as though unsure of their own foundations, the sign bearing the Whitmore name long since painted over in dull brown. A few men noticed the wagon first, then the woman seated beside the lumberjack, her posture straight, her chin lifted not in pride but in certainty. Murmurs began before the horse had fully stopped. Ezekiel stepped down first and offered his hand, not as a display, but as acknowledgement, and Clara accepted it with calm composure before turning toward the largest building near the square, the one that now housed the land registry. Inside, the air smelled of ink and old paper, and the clerk behind the desk looked up with mild irritation that quickly shifted to unease as recognition dawned. "We require access to the original transfer records of the Whitmore Timber Holdings," Clara said, her voice steady, carrying across the room without strain. There was no tremor in her tone, no plea, only request grounded in right. The clerk hesitated, glancing toward the back office where two men who had once shaken her father's hand now stood in stiff conversation. Ezekiel remained a step behind her, broad shoulders relaxed, not looming, not threatening, simply present. One of the men approached, smile thin and practiced. "Miss Whitmore," he began, as though the title were a courtesy granted rather than inherited. "We believed your affairs had been settled." Clara unfolded the document and placed it gently on the desk. "Settled requires consent," she replied. "Kindly produce the original contracts bearing my father's signature." Silence stretched. The second man cleared his throat, offering an explanation about oversight and necessity, about debts and obligations, but Clara did not raise her voice to counter him. She pointed instead to a date on the paper. "This transfer occurred 3 days after my father was declared medically unfit to conduct business," she said evenly. "Any agreement signed within that period is legally contestable." The clerk shifted, the color draining slightly from his face as he realized the implications. Ezekiel spoke only once. "We will wait," he said, tone calm as a still river. There was no accusation in his words, only patience sharpened by certainty. The room, once filled with quiet confidence, now felt smaller, the air heavier. Outside, townsfolk gathered near the windows, curiosity replacing mockery as whispers traveled faster than hoofbeats. After several tense minutes, the clerk retrieved a ledger from the back room and set it on the desk with reluctant care. Clara turned the pages slowly, eyes scanning each entry with precision, and when she stopped, she did not smile. She simply tapped a line where a witness signature was missing. "Incomplete," she said softly. The word fell into the room like a stone into still water. Ezekiel watched the ripple spread through the faces before him and understood that justice had begun to shift not through spectacle, but through ink, dates, and the calm refusal to be erased. The word incomplete did not echo loudly, yet it carried farther than any accusation could have, and the room inside the registry office seemed to shift on its foundation as Clara Whitmore kept her finger resting lightly on the blank line where a witness signature should have stood. The two men who had once spoken confidently about protection now avoided her eyes, their polished boots suddenly less steady against the wooden floor. Ezekiel Boone remained beside her, silent and solid as a timber post set deep in the ground, his presence neither aggressive nor passive, simply immovable. The clerk cleared his throat and leaned closer to the ledger, adjusting his spectacles as though hoping the missing name might appear under closer inspection. It did not. Clara turned another page slowly, her movements measured, revealing additional transfers recorded within the same narrow window of her father's illness, each one lacking proper verification. "These entries were processed in haste," she said calmly. "Without lawful witnesses, the transfers are contestable under state statute." One of the men attempted a strained smile. "Miss Whitmore, surely we can resolve this privately." The tone had shifted now, no longer dismissive, but cautious. Clara met his gaze without raising her voice. "It was handled publicly," she replied. "It will be corrected publicly." Outside the windows, townspeople gathered in growing numbers, curiosity replacing old assumptions as whispers moved from one storefront to the next. They had expected embarrassment, perhaps anger, but what they witnessed instead was composure sharpened by knowledge. The clerk finally stepped back from the desk, sweat forming lightly along his brow despite the cool morning air. "If the signatures are invalid," he admitted carefully, "the deeds must revert pending proper review." The admission landed with quiet finality. Ezekiel watched the ripple move through the room, the subtle recalculation in every face present. Clara folded the ledger closed herself, not with triumph, but with precision, and placed both hands upon it. "Then begin the review," she said. "Restore the records to their lawful status until a court determines otherwise." There was no need for raised voices, no need for threats. The ink spoke plainly. The dates stood undeniable. The crowd outside fell silent as the clerk nodded, defeated not by force, but by fact. As Clara stepped away from the desk, she did not glance at the men who had orchestrated her father's downfall. She did not gloat. She did not accuse. She simply walked toward the door, sunlight spilling across the wooden floor as it opened, illuminating her path in clear morning gold. Ezekiel followed one pace behind, not as guardian, not as owner, but as partner. When they stepped back onto the street, the murmurs had changed. There was no laughter now, only a careful respect that had not existed days before. The town had tried to measure her worth in dollars and spectacle, yet it was quiet dignity and a steady hand over ink that had undone them. And as the wagon rolled away once more, the sign bearing the Whitmore name no longer felt like a relic painted over in brown. It felt like a promise waiting to be restored, not through noise, but through the simple insistence that truth, once spoken calmly, does not retreat. Autumn arrived quietly in the weeks that followed, brushing the forest in muted gold and deep rust, and the clearing around the cabin felt larger somehow, as if the land itself had straightened its back. The legal review moved forward without spectacle, signatures examined, transfers reversed pending proper hearing, and by the time the first frost silvered the grass each morning, the Whitmore holdings had been restored to Clara's name in the registry books, not as a favor, not as mercy, but as correction. The town adjusted the way towns do, slowly and without apology. The painted sign above the largest building stripped and redone, the gold lettering returned under steady hands, and those who had once spoken confidently about protection now lowered their voices when her name was mentioned. Yet Clara did not move back into the grand house that had once overlooked Main Street. Instead, she rode each week to inspect the timber lots, to review accounts with a calm precision that left little room for dispute, and each time she returned to the cabin by the creek before nightfall. Ezekiel Boone did not ask her to stay, and he did not ask her to leave. He continued splitting wood measured to 18 inches, repairing fences board by board, and recording each sale in the ledger they now kept together, two distinct scripts aligned on the same page. One evening, as the sun sank behind the ridge and painted the sky in a quiet blaze of orange, Clara stood on the porch beside him, hands resting lightly on the railing he had carved years before. "They expect me to celebrate," she said softly, "to host dinners, to reclaim what was taken with display." Ezekiel looked out over the tree line, the creek murmuring steady as ever. "And what do you expect?" he asked. She considered the question, eyes tracing the stacked wood, the repaired fence, the land tended with patience rather than pride. "I expect stability," she replied. "And partnership." The words settled between them with weight and warmth. Ezekiel removed his hat, turning it slowly in his hands, a gesture he reserved for moments that mattered. "Then let it be chosen," he said evenly. "Not assumed, not purchased." She stepped closer, not hurried, not hesitant, and met his gaze with the same composure she had carried into the registry office. "You paid $2, she said quietly, not as reminder, but as recognition. "You gave me something no one else did." He waited. "Choice," she finished. The wind moved gently through the trees, lifting a strand of her hair into the fading light, and in that stillness there was no crowd, no auction block, no ledger on display. There was only open sky and a cabin built by honest hands. "Will you build the rest of this life with me?" she asked, voice steady as the creek below. Ezekiel did not answer with flourish. He set his hat back upon his head and offered his hand, calloused and certain. "As equal," he said. Clara placed her hand in his without ceremony, and the gesture carried more promise than any public vow. In the months that followed, there was no grand wedding in town. Only a simple ceremony beneath the tall firs, a preacher speaking softly while the forest bore witness, and when it was done, they returned to the cabin together, not as buyer and bought, not as rescuer and rescued, but as partners who had measured each other in patience and found the value true. Out beyond the clearing, the town continued its business, learning in quiet ways that worth cannot be shouted down or sold off for coin, and that sometimes the strongest correction arrives not with raised fists, but with steady hands and the courage to stand still. In that corner of the frontier, justice did not thunder. It settled, calm and enduring, like timber set deep into the earth.